This is the second session on our class about the 6 sources of Unitarian Universalism, and the source we're talking about today is Jewish and Christian teachings that call us to respond to God's love by loving our neighbors as ourselves. And in our last session we talked about the Jewish tradition, and this week we're going to talk about the Christian tradition. And in particular, we're going to talk about the liberal Christian tradition, out of which both denominations, which merged in the 1960s, the Unitarian Church and the Universalist Church, come out of that liberal Christian tradition. And so one of the ways you know we come from the Christian tradition is when we meet for worship, which is Sunday morning at 11 o'clock. I had a friend, Kahin Nasser, who is from Somalia, and he was a very Universalist Muslim. And so I would, one day he was telling me about his religious beliefs. He said, you know, I have lived in Egypt and India and Somalia, and I have been in churches and synagogues and mosques and temples, and in every single one I felt a holy presence. So I said to him, I said, you know, you would probably really like going to the Unitarian Universalist Church. And he said, oh yes, I would love to come to your prayer meeting on Friday night. So one of the ways you know we come from the Christian tradition is that we meet at Sunday morning at 11 o'clock. If we came from the Jewish tradition or Muslim tradition or Buddhist tradition, we would probably meet at another time. In our last session we talked about how Barry Whittemore said that you can think of Unitarian Universalism as a 2,000-year-old Jewish reform movement. Another way to think about it is as coming out of the left wing of the Protestant Reformation, or part of the continuing Reformation of the church. And if you know anything about Protestant Reformation, you know that one of the most important principles is the priesthood of all believers. That the ultimate arbiter about what is right or wrong is not the church hierarchy, it is not a bishop, it is the individual conscience. It's the priesthood of all believers. The individual conscience is the voice of God within us, the still small voice within us, and that is central, plays a central authoritative role in our lives. My father is an Episcopal priest, and when Gene Robinson was ordained as an Episcopal bishop, it was very controversial at that time because he was an openly gay man, and my father called me and said, I suppose the idea of a gay bishop would not be controversial in your church. And I said, well, actually, the idea of a bishop would be very controversial. And that's because our church is a very egalitarian church. There is not a lot of emphasis on hierarchy. It's more about congregational autonomy and the conscience of the individual. So here are some themes that are from the Christian tradition that are important to us and make up kind of the liberal Christian tradition. On the night before he was arrested, Jesus wrapped a towel around him and washed the feet of his disciples, humbling himself and taking the form of a servant. And he said to them, a new commandment give I unto you, that you love one another as I have loved you. By this all shall know you are my disciples. By this you shall know all are my disciples. That is an important teaching in the Unitarian Church. Historians often focus on what Jesus taught, and theologians and mystics speculate about what he thought. But in our tradition, the most important thing is how he loved, and the implications it has for how we can love one another. A new commandment give I unto you, that you love one another. There's another story that sort of illustrates one of the central principles. The disciples are arguing over who's the greatest, who's the best. They're on an ego trip. And Jesus looks at them and says, the greatest among you shall be your servant. The greatest among you shall be your servant. So it is through service, it is through helping others that we find our greatness. And that's an important theme in Unitarian and Universalist church traditions. Universalist church used to have an affirmation that said, love is the doctrine of our church, and service is our prayer. Love is the doctrine of this church, and service is its prayer. Another important part that comes out of the Christian tradition is the parable of the Good Samaritan that is taught by Jesus. And if you're probably familiar with the story that a merchant is beaten and set on the side of the road and he's left for dead. And the first person who comes along is a priest in the temple, a very religious man, but he doesn't help at all. He doesn't help. The second person to come along is an assistant to the priest, but the priest and the assistant, neither one of them help. The assistant just goes on. And the next person who comes along is not well thought of in the Jewish community, a Samaritan. They are the heretics, they are the blasphemers, they're the people who are beyond the pale. But it's the Samaritan that helps. And this is an important theme. If we were to tell that parable today, we might call it the good atheist, or the good blasphemer, or the good heretic. It's not about what we have up here. It's not about what we think. It's what we do. It's how we help. That's the most important theme. You can see the Christian Jewish traditions. Christianity comes out of the Jewish traditions. And James, the brother of Jesus, is considered one of the more Jewish theologians among the Christian tradition. And one of the themes he hits is important to us. He says, faith without works is dead. You show me your faith apart from your works, and I by my works shall show you my faith. So this idea that faith calls us to action, calls us to be a compassionate presence in the world. And this is a natural outflow of faith. When Jesus was asked to describe the difference between a false prophet and a true prophet, he said, by their fruits you shall know them. And the Apostle Paul sort of expounded upon that by saying the fruits of the Spirit are love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithful, gentleness, and self-control. Note that the qualities of the Spirit, note that the fruits of the Spirit aren't sound doctrine or infallible theology or rigid ritual. That's not the fruit of the Spirit. The fruit of the Spirit is gentleness, love, patience, goodnesses, things that come out of us that make us more compassionate. One of the theological themes that was important in the Universalist tradition comes out of the letters of John, and it's summarized in 3 words. God is love. God is love. And if you go to some of the old Universalist churches, that they often have those words inscribed on the altar or on the pulpit or on the fellowship hall over a fireplace, the words God is love, repeated over and over again, sometimes in the stained glass windows it's written in. It's an important theme. And so St. John says, how can you say that you love God who you have not seen if you do not love your brother or your sister who you have seen? This is one of the important themes during the Holocaust. Some of the people who worked to save Jews from the Holocaust, that was one of their operating maxims. How can you say you love God who you have not seen if you do not help people in need who you can see? So that's an important part of the Universalist tradition. If you go into a historic Unitarian church, you'll often see a triangle in one of the stained glass windows, and at the top of the triangle there's an eye, a human eye. You can see that in your money. There's actually, this image is in the $1 bill. It's the eye of reason. And the eye of reason can look at life from many different perspectives and see it from many different angles. When William Ellery Channing preached the sermon that led to the foundation of the Unitarian Church, he chose a text from the book of Thessalonians. Prove all things and hold fast to that which is good. Prove all things and hold fast to that which is good. The search for spiritual wisdom is sort of like mining for gems. You have to sort through some dirt and some sand, but then the gems emerge. So, do that sorting. Prove all things and hold fast to that which is good. So the use of reason is very important. One of the things William Ellery Channing said, your reason is a God-given gift. Now that's not a universal principle. I was listening to a radio preacher who was talking about how our reason often leads us astray and will lead us into the fires of hell, and was just very distrustful of reason. But William Ellery Channing would say that you should no more abandon the use of your reason for thinking than you abandon the use of your feet for walking, or your ears for hearing, or your eyes for seeing, or your nose for smelling. It's just part of who we are. You can't even make an argument against reason without using your reason. And so we should use our reason to the maximum extent. Thomas Jefferson described this in his letter to his nephew Peter Carr. He said, "Question boldly even the existence of God, for if there be a God, God will more approve the homage of reason than blindfolded fear." So this is an important theme in Unitarian tradition. Trust reason more than blindfolded fear. Well, those are some of the themes that come out of Unitarian Universalist tradition, or Christian tradition, that inform our faith tradition. In the 19th century, if you'd asked someone what Unitarians believe, they might have said they believe in the fatherhood of God, the brotherhood of man, and the neighborhood of Boston. That's how provincial we were at that time. But our ideas about God are bigger than that now, much bigger than that. And our ideas about human nature and human connection and the human family and gender identity and gender equality, all of that is bigger than that now. And certainly our ideas about what our neighborhood is in a universe is much bigger than that. So next week we will be talking about the world religions and what we have to learn from the world religions. This week we've been talking about Christianity. Next week we will talk about what's more.